And thank you. And we'll begin. So as I indicated, the purpose of the meeting today is to discuss updates to two policies and protocols that govern MEPA review. One is greenhouse gas policy protocol, and the second is related to climate resiliency. We'll be covering the GHG policy updates from 2 to 3 p.m. And then from 3 to 4, we'll be covering the climate resiliency policy updates. So as indicated here, this is what we're calling a straw proposal, which means that this is a conceptual proposal that's being presented today. The full language of the policy updates is not yet available for comment. However, we are taking public comment on the straw proposal until September 16th, 2024. And we do have the email address where those comments can be sent later in the slide deck. Next slide. In terms of content, I will first go over some basic background to what the current policy is. It was issued in 2010. And then we'll go over potential updates in 4 areas. One is stationary source, second, land alteration, a third is mobile source, and fourth, social cost of carbon. And as is indicated here, a discussion around the MEPA GHG policy was held about 2 years ago as a part of our advisory committee meeting process that was conducted in 2022. And all of those materials are still available on the MEPA website at the link that's shown here. There are some new components, however, that will be presented today. Next slide. Just a bit of background about the MEPA program. As many of you, I'm sure know, it's modeled on the National Environmental Policy Act program, or NEPA. Federal NEPA is an environmental review that occurs based on the existence of federal actions, such as federal permitting, and state MEPA is premised on state actions, like state permits and approvals. The concept is that a comprehensive environmental review is conducted before a project obtains those state approvals, and exploring project alternatives and promoting public participation in review of the project are key components. And more relevant to the discussion today, a statute was passed in 2008 that requires consideration of climate change, including the potential for projects to increase greenhouse gas emissions, as well as to adapt to future climate conditions, which are the 2 topics for discussion today. Next slide. So in 2010, as I mentioned, the initial greenhouse gas policy at MEPA was issued and is currently in effect. The policy has various components, one of which is to consider stationary sources of greenhouse gas emissions. Primarily, the focus here is on proposed new buildings and the energy use associated with those buildings. We also currently look at mobile sources of greenhouse gas emissions from traffic that is generated by the project. The policy also makes reference to potential additional sources, including what's referenced as unusually large amount of forest or land clearing. And currently, the policy indicates that the requirements of the policy apply where a project clears 50 acres or more of land. And consistent with other policies at MEPA, the GHG policy applies to so-called EIR projects that are required to prepare environmental impact reports. Sorry, I saw a question in the chat about how many people are in the audience, and presently there are 32 attendees. This is webinar format, so I understand it can be a little mysterious as to how many other folks are here, but there are 32 attendees and 60 registered for the program, so I'm hoping to have full attendance by the end. Okay, next slide. Okay, now we will move on to a presentation from the Department of Energy Resources about stationary sources, which, as I indicated, currently the focus is primarily on new building construction. And in terms of questions, we will take questions at the end of each segment. So after the DOER presentation, there'll be an opportunity for some questions. You cannot present them live, but there is a Q&A function that you can use to submit your questions. And we'll take a brief break and answer those questions and then move on to the rest of the presentation around greenhouse gas emissions policy. Okay, so now I'll turn it over to DOER, Paul Ormond for this presentation.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thanks, Tori. So my name is Paul. I work at the Department of Energy Resources. We're the state energy office that reviews MEPA submissions with respect to building GHG. You can skip to the next, the next slide. We're going to skip some of these intro ones here and save some time. Next. Okay, we'll start there. So we'll get right into the particular updates we're proposing. There's a total of 3 updates. So the first update is to create a pathway that will greatly simplify the MEPA process for projects that totally voluntarily opt into agreeing to construct their buildings to GHG best practices that we identify. So for the buildings that propose to build their building to those best practices, they'd be eligible for this opt-out, and there'd be no evaluations and review necessary from that point on. Now, if the building did not choose to select the, to go down this pathway, then the MEPA review process remains much like it is today. So it's completely optional to do this opt-out. Now, the one change to the current, if you choose to not conduct the opt-out, the one change in terms of the review process from there on is that we'd ask you to evaluate a scenario that conforms to the opt-out, and then we can take a look at how what you're proposing to do compares to that as well. So it's a completely optional thing. It can be done to any level or extent that you wish, building by building. So for example, if your project had 10 buildings, you could choose to make 6 of them comply with the opt-out appropriate for each of those buildings. And then they kind of finish their review. And then the other buildings, you could go through the normal process. So it's designed to be something flexible that is optional for a project to take advantage of. At the end, we'll discuss the particulars of the opt-outs. Why don't you go to the next slide? We'll skip this one because at the end it has more specifics about the opt-outs. So this is the second update, update number 2. We're proposing to revise the way that mitigation commitments are expressed. So the way that we currently do this is that commitments are expressed as a % better GHG reduction over a code base case. And this is something that's very out of date for the kind of strategies that are necessary for successful decarbonization. So the % better, for example, doesn't really capture efforts towards electrification. It doesn't capture efforts towards EV readiness, things of that nature. And what we would propose to do is replace the % better with specifics. So for example, if a project is committing to electrification of space heating, then that would be identified as a commitment. The same with water heating. The other characteristics here would be reduction in thermal, improvement in thermal performance of a building by virtue of its thermal TEDI rating, air infiltration reduction, things of that nature. Why don't you go to the next slide? So the third update we would propose is to update the grid emissions rate that is being used in the evaluations. What we currently do is we use the grid emission rates that are more or less current with current grid emission rates of our electric grid. But this is pretty out of date because the electric grid is getting greener and greener with each passing year with the adoption of solar and offshore wind, and that's accelerating. So we don't think that evaluations with respect to using current year grid emission rates are a very good representation of the emissions of electrification options. So we would propose to switch that to a grid emissions rate that is consistent with what we think the grid will be 30 years out, and that in 2050 specifically. So that would be more representative of the building carbon footprint for the choice of efficient electrification. Would you go to the next slide? So let's discuss these opt-outs in particular. They're tied to building size and building use type. So if your building is non-residential, small building, less than 20,000 square feet, except for those exceptions there, the opt-out is to follow the all-electric pathway of the specialized code and include lower air infiltration, C406 option 8, and use air source heat pump for water heating, or you could use solar thermal with electric resistance. So just again, if your building complies with these things, then there's no evaluations necessary. It would be recognized, acknowledged that that particular building following the standard is following GHG best practices, and that allows you to save the time and cost, et cetera, of doing all sorts of evaluations to demonstrate that you're doing best practices from a GHG standpoint. So that's how this would work for this kind of building. Next slide. So if you had a non-residential large commercial building, except for those types that are indicated in the title, it's the same sort of pattern. It would be the all-electric pathway, the specialized code with lower air infiltration and the air source heat pump water heating, or solar thermal with electric resistance water heating. But we would also add for a larger building a requirement that the use of blaze wall systems is done more judiciously with a maximum use of 50% of the above grade vertical surface area. Next slide. So for high ventilation buildings, you would have a choice of being all electric or mixed fuel pathway. Now, remember, though, that the mixed fuel pathway, or that either way, you'd have to use 25% of your peak space heating would need to be met with heat pumps. So it's sort of built into this. But you could choose to stay at just the 25% code required and do the rest with gas using the hybrid strategy that's common. And then coupled with that, the low air infiltration, the max 50% glaze wall system, and then a similar approach for the water heating. Next slide. For a warehouse, similar situation here. It could be all electric, or it could be hybrid with 25% of the peak load with heat pumps. The service water heating similar as the others. And then the one change here with respect to warehouse is to use a somewhat improved over code roof with R40 specifically. And that's identifying here that the value here is that a huge amount of the surface area of a warehouse, because of its large footprint, is through the roof. So therefore, that's worthy of improvement. And then it's sort of future-proofing things, because that same roof is also a good candidate for solar systems in the future. So we want to have an as improved roof as possible prior to installation of solar systems, so we don't have to do any renovations or retrofits in the future. Next slide. For restaurants, it would be all electric pathway, a specialized code, plus the low air infiltration and the similar type water heating. Next slide. Now for residential, there's a couple of if-thens here. So if your residential is 3 stories or less, it would be the all-electric pathway of the specialized code. And If your building is 5 dwelling units or less, it would be either HERS 40 or passive house as the standard. If it's 5 units or more, I'm sorry, I should say if it's less than 5 dwelling units, so 1 through 4, HERS 40 or passive house. If it's 5 or more dwelling units, the standard is passive house, and that aligns with the mass save incentives. That's why we make that distinction. And then similar rules of the road for the water heating if the buildings are single family or townhouse type or designs. Next slide. If the residential is more than 3 stories, then it's the all-electric path with a specialized code, passive house. And if the individual building has more than 50 units, it would be air source heat pump water heating. That's recognizing that there's a lot of options that are emerging that are central air source heat pump water heaters that can be used in large building settings. That requirement is not there if your building is less than 50 units. It would be only required for 50 units or more. I think that's what I have for this deck. So yeah, just once again to reinforce that the opt-outs are totally voluntary. So if you're, for whatever reason that you wish to not do, one of the items, et cetera, that is completely acceptable. We would just go through the same review process that you do now. We would ask you to evaluate the opt-out scenario as a scenario, so we can kind of compare and contrast and evaluate whether the alternative choice that you have in mind might be just as good. So again, totally voluntary for the opt-outs. Hopefully something that people would choose a lot, save everyone a lot of time and costs and headaches getting through the MEPA review process. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Paul. So yeah, I know some of this is somewhat technical, but as Paul indicated, I think, I would characterize this change as largely continuing what we have been doing already since 2010. However, in some of the earlier slides that Paul skipped over, some of that background was the fact that through some changes to the building stretch code that were put into effect recently in 2023, there have been a lot of developments and improvements in the legally mandated code for how new buildings should be constructed. So the concept here is at MEPA, if proponents are making high-level commitments along the same lines, that MEPA review could be streamlined and made simpler. So I think that's the high-level, sort of the highlight for that change, for this change to stationary source. Okay, so with that, why don't we stop the recording for 1 minute and take some today. Okay, so we'll move on to the next few components of the MEPA greenhouse gas policy updates. We just covered the stationary source component with a presentation from the Department of Energy Resources. So there are 3 additional updates that we're proposing as part of our greenhouse gas policy. I would characterize these 3 components as somewhat more conceptual in nature at this stage. The stationary source component is fairly prescriptive, as you saw with the multiple slides, but the rest of the content is still somewhat conceptual, but we did want to get the concepts out for public comment for early feedback before we started to put pen to paper on some of these changes. So the first of these remaining areas relates to land alteration in particular, particularly forest and tree clearing. Next slide. So first, just a bit of background around state planning with respect to forest clearing, and particularly what's referenced as natural and working lands. So as some of you know, in contrast to prior state planning around greenhouse gas emissions reductions, the 2025, 2030, as well as the 2050 Clean Energy and Climate Plan now focuses very much on natural and working lands and emphasizes the importance of preserving those lands and particularly the carbon storage potential in natural and working lands as a key component to getting to our reduction goals of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And as you see at the bottom of the slide, there are certain goals and metrics that are in the CECP, including, for example, a goal of preserving 40% of Massachusetts lands and waters permanently by 2050, as well as creating new tree cover, 64,400 acres by 2050. So in this regard, the MEPA program has been identified specifically in many of these planning documents. So the 2025, 2030, and 2050 CECP indicated that the MEPA office should deliberate with its advisory board about the concept of adding a new review threshold. So that would be in regulation related to forest clearing, which would have the effect of bringing in new projects for review in the MEPA program. And it also indicated a carbon accounting methodology should be developed. So as is indicated here, we did in fact deliberate with the advisory committee. I see some of the attendees were members of the committee as well. So in June of 2022, the idea of a new regulatory threshold was discussed. However, we did not choose to move forward with a regulatory change at that time. In 2023, the Massachusetts newly appointed climate chief, Melissa Hoffer, released recommendations, which reiterated again that the MEPA program should consider a regulatory change to address forest clearing, including a potential new threshold. But it also referenced the greenhouse gas policy as another area of consideration, and to lower the acreage at which the policy requirements would apply to projects that are already subject to MEPA review. The recommendations also referenced potentially creating a mitigation fund to offset the impacts of forest clearing. So at this time, the MEPA office is still not considering a regulatory change. This proposal, I should say, just to correct, this proposal does not relate to a regulatory change. That is something under consideration, but at this time, we are moving forward only with the policy change for now. Next slide. So in terms of regulation, these are the review thresholds that are currently in regulation. So the principal ones here being the direct alteration of 50 acres, 50 or more acres, which triggers a mandatory EIR or environmental impact report requirement, and 25 or more acres, which it triggers the requirement to file an ENF or a environmental notification form. Again, we are not proposing to change these regulations at this time, although we have been directed to consider a regulatory change at some point in the future. Next slide. So what is the change that we are proposing? What we're proposing is to look at the greenhouse gas policy and the reference in the policy to projects altering 50 acres or more as being the trigger for when the existing requirements under our policy would apply. We're proposing to lower this to reference projects that alter any land clearing at any review threshold. And currently 25 acres is the lowest review threshold for land alteration. So obviously, if there is a regulatory change at a future time, that could be a different acreage. But as you just saw in the prior slide, presently 25 acres is the lowest review threshold for land alteration that triggers the need for MEPA review. So at 25 or more acres, the requirements of the GHG policy would now apply. Next slide. We are also proposing to develop some associated guidance that would provide some clear rules around how the carbon impacts of forest clearing should be assessed. Now, as some of you may know, this area is quite complex in terms of how to quantify the carbon effects of forest clearing. So we are intending to establish a standard methodology using publicly available mapping tools. There would always be the option of the proponent to conduct a site-specific assessment, for instance, a forest inventory at the proponent's election. The guidance document would also provide mitigation options and best practices around how to mitigate the effects of forest clearing if that clearing could not be avoided or minimized, including some of the items here: reusing wood products, tree replanting, and permanent land conservation, as well as heat reduction strategies in overburdened areas. We're also considering a creation of a fund in a type of in lieu fee mitigation framework. However, that would require a statutory change, so we're not proposing to create one through the policy, but we did want to at least mention the possibility of that in this straw proposal to solicit some initial public feedback on that concept. As I indicated before, we are considering an additional regulatory change, as was directed by some of the more recent planning documents. And if those changes are proposed, that will be discussed in future stakeholder meetings. Next slide. Okay, so that's the change relative to land alteration. It's a pretty simple one at this time. We're simply saying that to the extent projects are required to undergo review, that the requirements of the policy would apply at a lower acreage than is currently the case. So we're also looking at mobile sources, so essentially from new traffic generated by projects. Next slide. So again, a bit of background about state planning around greenhouse gas emissions from the mobile sources from the transportation sector. The Clean Energy and Climate Plan reiterates that the transportation sector remains a high emitting source for greenhouse gas emissions. It sets some sublimits for this sector and establishes some targets and metrics. Of course, a key strategy is electrification and getting more electric vehicles on the road. But the CECP also mentions what I would characterize as soft metrics and targets around VMT reduction. So VMT referring to vehicle miles traveled. So we acknowledge that with more development and more growth in the state, VMT, vehicle miles traveled, could increase. However, the CECP indicates that a reduction in VMT on a per household basis is a key strategy, as well as improving transit, access to transit as an alternative to vehicular modes of travel. Next slide. So what are the policy updates that are proposed? So at this time, the actual policy update is simply a technical one. It is to align with existing practice around traffic study methodology. So to generate a greenhouse gas emissions number, the methodology currently is essentially to conduct a traffic study, generate a vehicle miles traveled number from the traffic study, which correlates to greenhouse gas emissions. However, a traffic study typically starts from existing conditions, which is conditions as of today. It also presents future so-called no-build conditions, which is background roadway conditions without the project in the future, and then compares that to the so-called build condition. And it's this no build to build difference that presents the project impact. And as a practical matter, that is how the greenhouse gas emissions calculation comes in as part of MEPA filings. However, because our greenhouse gas policy is somewhat outdated, it does not reflect current practice. So the primary change here is simply a technical edit to align with existing practice. I don't foresee this will have major changes to how this assessment is being conducted currently. Next slide. But this is another change in that we may put out through guidance that we wanted to put out for general feedback. Again, this is a conceptual proposal at this time. But because state planning and the CECP indicates a goal of reducing VMT per household, we're also considering putting out a standard methodology for reporting VMT that would be expressed as total VMT for the project, as opposed to just the VMT for the small traffic study radius around the project site. And then based on county-based household numbers, you should be able to calculate a per household metric for the project. As some of you may be aware, California has already moved to this framework and has a standard methodology for reporting on VMT and associated greenhouse gas emissions from traffic. Again, we're not intending to create a new methodology that requires a complex site-specific assessment of work to home to work commuting patterns, et cetera. We're contemplating a standard methodology based on publicly available resources that would allow for an easy way to track progress towards the CECP goals. And we would also provide guidance on mitigation strategies. And as with the stationary source component, having a metric like VMT per household allows us to consider some opt-out strategies as well for projects making a high level of commitment, for instance, to mode share targets, or making contributions to transit improvements as well as another example. So this is somewhat conceptual at this stage. If we do get positive feedback, we do anticipate putting out more language and more specific methodology in the future. But at this time, we are proposing as a reporting metric to at least adopt or put out a methodology for calculating total VMT for the project per household. And then, as indicated at the bottom here, we are considering future changes to environmental justice protocols, which address air emissions impacts from traffic. So that would be presented at future stakeholder meetings, but wanted to flag that as under consideration as well. Next slide. Okay, so that's the piece on mobile sources. The last component is what the so-called social cost of carbon. Next slide. So this responds to, again, recommendations in the Climate Chief's report from 2023, which simply recommended that state MEPA follow federal NEPA guidance that was issued through the Council on Environmental Quality. The CEQ now mandates that all federal NEPA reviews consider what's called the social cost of carbon, meaning that if a project generates or results in increased greenhouse gas emissions, what is the corresponding social cost as expressed as a dollar value of that additional carbon into the environment in terms of public health effects and other social consequences. So the main concept here in terms of a policy update would be that the MEPA greenhouse gas policy, consistent with federal NEPA and the federal greenhouse gas policy guidance, would allow, at the Secretary's discretion, the ability to require social cost of carbon analysis as appropriate on a case-by-case basis. We've also noted here that the Mass Save program at DOER adopted a particular dollar value associated with social cost of carbon in March of 2024. Now, these values, because of the effects of inflation and other factors, do tend to change over time. So the policy would not indicate a specific dollar value, but simply reference the latest values that have been adopted by the state using this methodology. So to date, we've incorporated social cost of carbon language in just one project that proposed to expand fossil fuel infrastructure through new gas pipelines. So it's quite possible that this would be applied only to major energy infrastructure expansions of that nature. But again, the concept is simply to incorporate language that allows for this consideration on a case-by-case basis. Next slide. So this is a potential schedule for this year and early next year. As you're well aware, we're issuing the straw proposal now, comments due by September 16th, holding public information sessions. We're also open to holding smaller focus group discussions upon request. So if any of you attending today would like to request that, please feel free to be in touch. As I indicated, we're anticipating putting out full language later in the fall for comment and hoping to come out with the full policy update by winter and spring of 2025. Next slide. And then ways to keep informed. This is the email address, MEPA-regs, R-E-G-S, @mass.gov is the email address where comments should be directed. And we also have a mechanism for joining a listserv to receive ongoing alerts. And the MEPA website has been updated and will continue to be updated with the latest information. Okay, so that's it for the prepared presentation. I see some questions in the chat, so we'll turn off the recording. Okay, so this portion of our presentation relates to the MEPA Climate Resiliency Policy, the full title being the Climate Change Adaptation and Resiliency Policy. Again, we're presenting what we're calling a straw proposal, which is a conceptual proposal for public comment, which is due by September 16th of 2024. The email address to submit comments will be presented at the end of the deck. The full language is not yet available. We are intending to put that out for comment later in the fall, but this is a policy in concept that we're considering to make changes to our climate resiliency policy. Next slide. So in terms of content here, first, we will have a presentation from one of our climate scientists on the EEA climate team to present on the Climate Resilience Design Standards tool. It's a tool that was released in April of 2021 and is currently in effect at MEPA as part of our climate resiliency policy. Many of you may have used this tool to assess MEPA projects and submit filings, but it's a good reminder of the functionalities that are available in the tool and why it's a good resource that we have decided to adopt at MEPA. And then we'll present on some project data. We did put out an interim protocol in October of 2021 and have continued to collect data based on the output reports from the climate resilience tool. And so we thought that would be an informative piece of information to present to the public. And then, of course, presenting on the potential updates to the climate resiliency policy. And as with the greenhouse gas policy, this was also discussed with the MEPA Advisory Committee in May of 2022. And all of those materials, again, are still available at the link shown here on the slide. Next slide. By way of brief background, as I indicated earlier, the Global Warming Solutions Act was the statute that was passed in 2008 to require consideration of climate change at MEPA. But in contrast to the greenhouse gas policy, which was issued shortly thereafter in 2010, MEPA was not successful in issuing a policy relative to climate adaptation and resiliency. A draft policy was issued for comment in 2014, but never finalized. Since then, there's been a significant amount of state planning, including through Executive Order 569 by Governor Baker, a statewide integrated plan for hazard mitigation and climate adaptation. And then as I said earlier, in April of 2021, the state released what's called the Climate Resilience Design Standards Tool. It's an online tool that's available to anyone in the public that allows the user, based on some information related to the project, to quickly assess the climate risks of the project under future conditions. So with the release of the tool, MEPA was comfortable putting out an interim protocol in October of 2021 that requires use of the tool as part of the project notification process, filing process. And since October, there's been further state planning, including the climate change assessment and an update to what's now called the Resilient Mass Plan. There's also additional Resilient Coast strategy that's underway. Next slide. Okay, so now we'll move to a presentation of the tool. Caitlin is here from the EEA Climate Office to give a sense of what the tool is and what some of the key functionalities are. So I'll turn it over to Caitlin.
Great, thank you, Tori. I'm pleased to introduce the Climate Resilience Design Standards tool for the MEPA straw proposal. Next slide. The Climate Resilience Design Standards tool was developed to make preliminary climate resilience analysis broadly accessible to anyone developing a physical project who's interested in understanding the potential climate change related risks to that project, even if they're not an expert in adaptation, climate change, flooding, extreme heat, etc. The tool was developed originally with the use case of informing climate smart capital planning at the state level, as well as more generally thinking about how to bring climate resilience into project design and procurement. What does the tool do? It provides a starting set of recommendations for climate resilience based on a consistent application of the state's climate change projections to different types of projects, and a unified tool for planning and design that state agencies like MEPA can use to support their programs as well as administering grant programs. Next slide. Users enter information about the project in the Climate Resilience Design Standards tool. The tool screens the project for climate risk, and tool outputs provide a basis of discussion for planning, early design, and evaluation that's standardized across Massachusetts based on what type of project or asset is proposed, where it is, how important its function is, its sensitivity to different climate hazards, what type of construction it is, and its useful life. The tool is most useful at the very beginning stages of proposing a project. So when one's thinking about where to put the project, what it is, and getting a sense of what it will take to make the project climate resilient. Bringing this screening and these recommendations in early in the project is the most recommended way to use the tool. Next slide. The tool can be found on resilient.mass.gov. The link to the page is at the bottom right hand of the screen. In addition to a login to use the tool, this page will provide many different resources documenting how the tool works and providing guidance and best practices for using the tool. So if you are ever using this tool and have a question about the inputs that it's asking for, these resources are a really helpful way to get guidance on how to answer questions or what some of that information might be. If you are ever curious about what data sets are being used in this tool to flag climate hazards or risk factors, that information is also available in some of the resources flagged on this screen. Next slide. To get started, users need to create an account to use the tool. External users can click on the login or register button. State users need to send an email to rmat@mass.gov to request a first-time access. Extra lead time is needed for new accounts at dot.state.ma.us email addresses. Next slide. To create a project, the first step is to draw a polygon at the project site. This is how the tool knows whether the project is, or one way the tool knows what climate hazards the project might be exposed to based on its physical location. Next slide. After drawing the project site and saving that shape, users will provide inputs in 4 steps that each correspond to one aspect of the project, its benefits, and its risk. Step 1 is entering core project information about basic things like what the project is. Step 2 asks the user to provide information on ecosystem service benefits the project might provide. Step 3 asks the user to answer questions related to exposure to climate hazards, as far as the user knows. And step 4 asks the user to create specific assets related to the project. So for example, a building, a parking lot, a rain garden, and fill in information about each of those assets. Next slide. This slide shows some examples of what some of those user inputs look like. Once the shape has been drawn, green text will appear under the little locate project half circle. The same will occur after entering all project inputs. Once inputs are complete, users can view project outputs, which are those preliminary recommendations. Next slide. The output starts by providing project level scores. So thinking about the project as a whole, whether the project is in an environmental justice, census, block group, or neighborhood, the level of ecosystem services the project will provide, and information scoring the project's exposure to 4 different climate hazards: sea level rise and storm surge, for which this example is highly exposed, urban or stormwater flooding, to which this project is moderately exposed, extreme heat, to which this example is highly exposed, and riverine flooding, which this project is not flagged as having any exposure to. Next slide. Information at the little question mark on each climate hazard exposure score will provide information on why the tool flagged this particular project as being, for example, highly exposed to sea level rise, but not exposed to riverine flooding. And if there are any questions about the pop-up text that occur, documentation on the tool page, which I described earlier, can provide more background information. Next slide. In addition to project level exposure scores, each asset created as part of the project will receive a risk rating for each of those climate hazards. So this example has 3 assets: a corridor revitalization, which is a transportation infrastructure type with an estimated useful life of 40 years, a green infrastructure improvement with an estimated lifespan of 20 years, and a dam or flood control structure with an estimated lifespan of 50 years. Each of these assets has its own risk rating for each of the 4 climate change related hazards. One thing to note is that while exposure scores have a not exposed category, for example, the project was rated not exposed to riverine flooding, there's no risk category. In the asset level risk scores, there's only a low risk rating, as we see for riverine flooding in this example. Next slide. Under each asset's risk rating, so in this case, the risk rating for sea level rise and storm surge, the tool will provide a target planning horizon for each asset based on its useful life. In this example, the target planning horizon is 2070, so the tool is recommending ultimately that this asset be designed to function in 2070 sea level rise and storm surge conditions. The tool, in the case of sea level rise and storm surge, also provides an intermediate planning horizon for multi-stage design and an event return period. So in this case, the 2% annual chance flood. The tool also provides design criteria and preliminary design values for multiple coastal flooding parameters for the target and intermediate planning horizons and for the recommended return period. Next slide. Here's an example of what the expanded information for one of those coastal flood parameters looks like. There's an explanation of what that parameter is. There's a table showing the actual elevation for that event in 2050 and 2070. And there's information expandable below on how that parameter can be used in different stages of the project life cycle, including project evaluation. Next slide. We wanted to highlight one tab under sea level rise and storm surge that actually shows maps of different parameters, elevations, so that users can get a sense of which parts of the project site are more and less exposed to coastal flooding. Additional parameters will be mapped in the version effective later this summer. Next slide. This is an example of the same type of output for extreme precipitation. In this example, the target planning horizon is 2050, and the asset is recommended to be designed for the 100-year or 1% annual chance storm. I wanted to highlight that the table under this parameter provides an actual design depth for that 2050 100-year storm to be used as a starting point in design. Next slide. And here's an example of the output for temperature, which also has a recommended planning horizon and temperature projection percentile. More information on what that means can be found in the documentation. And this is not currently part of the temperature output, but this summer, this part of the tool will provide actual recommended temperature metrics. Next slide. So users can view the project output that I just highlighted within the tool. When users would like to see more of a summary, they can move on to the View Report step, which will provide a summary of the project exposure scores and the asset specific risk ratings for different climate hazards. So this is a way to see more of a report or summary format version of the project output. There's also a download report button on this part of the page. The project reports can be helpful to save for future reference and attach to project filings. At this point, users can still make changes to project inputs and even project location if some of the details haven't been finalized yet. Next slide. On the next part of the tool page, users can submit this project so that it's stored in the Climate Resilience Design Standards tool database. After clicking the Submit button, users can no longer make any changes to the project information. Next slide. As Tori mentioned earlier, the beta version was released in April 2021. Several revisions have occurred since then, and the release of version 1.3 is in progress. This version will add updates to the temperature design standards and some additional maps showing coastal flood elevations. This version will also add several bug fixes that have been flagged by users. Next slide. This is not part of the tool, but I wanted to flag the climate projections dashboard, which can be found on resilient.mass.gov. This is a website showing a more comprehensive set of temperature and precipitation statistics, projected temperature and precipitation statistics, some of which are pulled into the Climate Resilience Design Standards tool. So it is a helpful place to go if the starting set of recommended design criteria don't seem like enough to someone using the tool, or they want to explore other design storms or higher temperature standards or similar items. Next slide. I also wanted to highlight the resources available to learn more about the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model data products, which are the main data source on coastal flooding brought into the tool. EEA's YouTube channel has 3 videos with documentation on using the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model data products at different levels in different applications. For users with advanced GIS and analytics capability, it's possible to actually download the flood risk rasters from the Woods Whole Group webpage. And for people who would just like to explore what the data look like, they are available on 3 different coastal flooding viewers. Next slide. That's it.
And an email address for questions. So thanks so much, Caitlin, for presenting today. Really appreciate the partnership from the Climate Office with use of the tool. So why don't we stop the recording for one? Okay, so we just completed a presentation from our Climate Office about the functionalities of the Climate Resilience Design Standards tool. So moving on, we have a few slides here that present some project data that MEPA has gathered based on the output reports that we have received from the Climate Resilience tool. And then we'll move on to the proposed policy updates. So these are data from October of 2021, when the interim protocol first went into effect, until the end of April of this year. Next slide. So as I indicated, an interim protocol is currently in effect, and the key components presently are that all new project filings must attach the output report from the Climate Resilience tool. So we have gotten good data on every single project filing at MEPA. We accept roughly 200 to 250 per year. We also added a section to the ENF form, the project notification form, that talks about information about climate resilience. So the 2021 interim protocol indicated that proponents were encouraged but not yet required to utilize the specific design recommendations or methodologies in the tool and indicated that the primary goal initially was to gather data to set the foundation for future policy updates. So it's been over a year, almost 2 years at this point, and we do feel like we're at a good position to move forward with those policy updates. So that's the point where we are now. Next slide. So in terms of project data, as I said, every new project filing, so not every filing like project change notices, but every new project has been required to submit an output report from the Climate Resilience Standards tool. So in this time period, we received 362 new project filings. About 96 exceeded those mandatory EIR thresholds and required an EIR. As some of you know, due to new legislation in 2021, every project that's located near an environmental justice area, at least 1 mile, also must file an environmental impact report. So we counted about 224 in this time frame that would fit in that category, although the EJ rules technically or formally went into effect in January of 2022. Next slide. In terms of project types, the tool, as Caitlin mentioned, categorizes projects as 3 separate categories. 1 is buildings and facilities, 2 is infrastructure, and 3 natural resources that are not intended to maintain a hard asset. So we divided our MEPA projects into these 3 broad categories. So our top category is always real estate development, so a variety of new buildings, but we also look at energy infrastructure that has a building component, and water, wastewater as well, and coastal projects. And of course, things like transportation, dams, utilities are all infrastructure projects that we look at. Natural resources projects include things like parks, trails without a building component, and ecological restoration. Next slide. So this is a visual depiction of the data. We thought it would be useful to divide our projects into FEMA zones. So the V zone being the coastal areas that are subject to wave action, the A zone being the inland floodplain, the so-called 100-year floodplain that's subject to flooding risk, and then the X zone, which is outside the 100-year floodplain. So for this V zone, we think there's not a lot of surprise here. 64 projects in the new projects in the V zone, and 62 were rated high. So all the red bars correlate to high risk. So vast majority rated high risk. For future risk for sea level rise, the tool incorporates data that allows you to look at future risk over the useful life of the project. For the A zone inland floodplain projects, again, not a big surprise. The 2 middle bars relate to extreme precipitation. You can't add up the 2 bars because extreme precip is 1 category. It's either riverine flooding if you're near a river or a stream, or urban flooding. So again, 161 projects in the A zone, and a good majority of those, 113 to 25, subject to some form of extreme precipitation risk over the useful life of the project. I think where the results were somewhat surprising were in the X zone areas, which are well outside the current floodplain and even outside the so-called 500-year floodplain. So 133 of those projects, and still you can see a good number of those are subject to risk. At least 50, half or more are subject to riverine flooding, and even more subject to urban flooding risk. So we thought that this really supports and reiterates the need for climate planning. It reinforces, at least what I've read, even in public reports, about the fact that projects and locations well outside the current 100-year floodplain are being subject to extreme precipitation and flooding risks. And our flood insurance program reports that the majority of claims that come in seeking coverage under flood insurance are also located outside the 100-year floodplain. Next slide. We also collected some data related to projects near environmental justice communities, so that 224 out of 362 new project filings. And again, we don't think there's big surprise here. A good majority of those, 175, subject to high risk for urban flooding, given that many of these communities are in urbanized locations, and extreme heat as well. And one thing I forgot to mention in the prior slide is for extreme heat, we are seeing the vast majority of projects coming in rated as high risk for heat over the useful life. And as we see, even in the conditions this week, this is a very real prospect that all of us face in many places, the vast majority of places throughout the state. Next slide. Some key observations from our project filings to date. The first one is what I just stated earlier. We are definitely seeing that projects even outside the floodplain are being ranked high risk for flooding risks. The so-called asset risk ratings, these are ratings that tie to the specific asset, like a building or a stormwater system that a project is proposing, and the associated design recommendations are somewhat variable. We have determined that the climate tool was in fact designed to provide variable results because different assets may have differing levels of criticality. You know, an emergency hospital for vulnerable populations, for instance, versus, you know, a recreational park that may not always be used. However, we do think that at times that these are dependent on user inputs, and we do think at times that the proponent filling out those inputs may not be assessing appropriately the criticality of a project. So this is something that we are looking to address through our policy updates. And then finally, very few filings contain actual quantitative analysis to support the project design and to demonstrate resiliency to climate conditions. Next slide. Okay, so we'll move on to what exactly are we proposing for changes. Next slide. So first off, in terms of basic filing requirements, we are proposing to continue to require the standard output report from the resilience design tool. I think we've seen very good compliance with the requirement in the interim protocol. And from what I understand it here, the use of the tool is fairly easy. And it's not a heavy lift to attach this report to the ENF form. So we are proposing to continue with that. We're also proposing to revise the ENF form itself to include some additional metrics, most of which can be taken directly from the output report that's generated from that tool. We're also proposing to require things like the FEMA flood zone, just to get a very quick picture of whether the project is currently in the floodplain and whether a BFE or base flood elevation has been established. And then we would require, as is currently the case, a narrative discussion of whether the project is anticipated to be consistent with recommendations from the tool and a description of the measures that will be incorporated. Next slide. So this is where we move into some additional analysis requirements that we're proposing for EIR. So this is, again, consistent with other policies, would apply to environmental impact reports. The primary one being to address simply whether the project is consistent with those tool recommendations in a quantitative fashion. So we would ask the project to consult the numeric values that are provided by the tool as a first step. with the option to provide alternative site-specific methodology at the proponent's option. And then if the project does not meet those recommendations, then the EIR should also address alternatives as well as adaptation strategies and compliance with other mandates. As I stated earlier, we have seen some variability in how a user is assessing the criticality and the useful life of a project. So for this, the policy would set out some best practices that's really consistent with guidance that's already been issued together with that climate resilience tool. So as an example, most what's called long-lived structures like permanent buildings should be assessed and should be planning for at minimum 40 to 60 years. But we do see some projects, even large residential buildings coming in, indicating they're only planning for 2030, for example. So a best practice is to plan for a longer planning horizon. And then a medium to high criticality as a sort of default for most permanent structures that are not intended to be temporary in nature. And then the secretary could require that that tool output be revised in the EIR based on review of the outputs that are attached as part of the ENF. Next slide. In terms of applicability, as I indicated, we're proposing that the analysis requirement apply to EIRs. That is the basic rule at MEPA. There are more EIRs now as a result of the EJ requirements, but the EJ legislation and our protocols specifically require consideration of climate change. So we're not intending to limit this requirement to the so-called mandatory EIR threshold projects, but all EIRs that are required mandatorily. Of course, the secretary has discretion to require EIRs at her discretion as well. In addition, we are proposing to amend the NPC form, the Notice of Project Change form, to require the climate output report as an attachment. So not the full analysis, but the climate output report. As a practical matter, we are requesting that NPCs assess climate risks anyway, and because of the rapidly changing nature of climate data and the importance of the issue of preparing for climate change, we do think it's appropriate for project change notices also to attach a basic climate risk assessment through the tool. And then for special review procedures, we would also have discretion to require a climate analysis. There would also be a de minimis exception. So the tool does return a not exposed ranking for climate parameters, for instance, sea level rise, if you're in an inland area. So if the tool returns a not exposed rating, then the EIR would not have to address that climate parameter. Next slide. So moving on to the actual analysis, what is the content of the EIR that would be required? So the concept here is that the policy would put out some minimum requirements as to climate assessment. I think this area tends to be highly technical, and so far, as I indicated earlier, much of the assessment we have received is more narrative in nature and a qualitative description. So in our policy, we're proposing to put in some minimum requirements that would have a quantitative component. But because the climate tool provides actual values and has very high functionality, we don't think this will impose a huge burden on proponents, because much of it would be a matter of comparing numeric values available through the tool to the project design. So the three areas that we're intending to put special focus on are structure elevation, stormwater sizing, and measures to address heat. So I will address those in turn here. In terms of structure, so we're talking about new buildings, any facilities, including infrastructure assets like transportation facilities. We would ask the proponent to address how high those structures are being elevated relative to the recommended standard. So for sea level rise, the tool will provide values for what's referenced as the wave action water elevation or the water surface elevation. So essentially, how high on the site will those future water elevations come, and to compare the building elevations to those values. Now, if there has been a base flood elevation or BFE established, we would ask you to address elevation relative to those values as well. And of course, if it's higher, we would ask you to address that higher value. For extreme precipitation and specifically riverine flooding, the tool does not currently provide the same level of granular information relative to a recommended elevation. So for here, this would relate to inland projects. We would ask you to compare the building elevation to any established BFEs if you're in the 100-year floodplain, or if you're in the so-called unnumbered A zone. We would ask for a determination of that BFE based on standard methodologies that are available, for instance, through the wetlands regulations. We do think, given the importance of the issue, if the project is currently in the 100-year floodplain, a minimum requirement should be to assess what an anticipated base flood elevation will be and where the building elevation is relative to that level. Now, in lieu of providing this comparison, of course, the proponent has the option to propose a site-specific design flood elevation based on its own quantitative assessment, and to indicate where future climate conditions may be under future conditions. And then if the project is not anticipated to meet recommendations, the EIR should provide a justification, including alternative locations that have been considered for the project. Okay, and then the second area where minimum requirements would be added is relative to stormwater sizing. So this would apply if the project is proposing a new stormwater system or a substantial improvement to one. And here, as Caitlin presented earlier, the tool does provide very good information about anticipated rainfall depth on a 24-hour basis associated with future storm events. And to the extent the tool output is not generated based on adequate user inputs, there's even a dashboard where one can look up any future storm scenario and the rainfall volumes and depths associated with those scenarios. So this would simply be a comparison. So if a future storm event, for example, correlates to a rainfall depth of 8 inches, then is the stormwater system sized to accommodate that level of precipitation? And then if the project will not meet that recommendation, it should provide a justification. Next slide. So the third area of special focus is extreme heat. So as was indicated earlier, the tool will provide some values related to future heat conditions. So this first bullet, I think, probably will need to be revised. I actually just learned that the tool will be updated to indicate values not expressed as a number of days increase over 90 degrees, but rather just simply the number of days, the actual average temperature under future conditions. So I think this first bullet is just simply intended to say that whatever the publicly available data is from the tool, that the EIR should reflect what the future heat condition will be. And then it should discuss ways that the project will reduce those heat risks, including some of the best practices mentioned here. And we would propose to put out guidance with some specific recommended strategies. I think things like pervious pavement, green roofs, tree replanting, all of these are best practices that are well known to reduce the heat risks. We're also looking at ways, as I indicated earlier, the tool is pretty much returning a high risk rating for every project. So we're also looking at ways to assess project sites that are currently under existing conditions already subject to special risks due to factors like the level of existing tree cover or existing impervious area. And for those sites, the policy would require some special attention and clear mitigation for additional tree removal or new impervious areas added to sites of that nature. We're also looking at some strategies, as we understand, the city of Somerville, for example, has a green score framework where the percentage of the project site that's covered by some form of green infrastructure or green strategy is reported, and there's a score assigned. So we are looking at some frameworks like that to provide more of a prescriptive framework for how an EIR project can demonstrate in a quantitative fashion that it's taking adequate steps to reduce the heat risks over the useful life of the project. Okay, and then, so those are the three areas where we would add some minimum analysis requirements. As those of you who are familiar with our process already knows, this some of this scoping language has already appeared in MEPA certificates. These are the areas that we are currently asking proponents to address. So we don't think this is a huge departure from what's already occurring. And we do think it's eminently reasonable and feasible to do, because much of this is simply comparing the project design to values that are available readily through that climate resilience tool. With respect to natural resource projects, consistent with current practice, we would require a narrative discussion of how the project addresses the standard recommendations from the tool and any other ecosystem benefits that it is providing. And then, of course, on a case-by-case basis, there could be additional analysis that currently occurs through the MEPA process, the key ones being on or off-site flood impacts, the sizing of proposed culverts, and coastal erosion. So these are frequent topics that are already raised during MEPA that could be required on a case-by-case basis. Next slide. Okay, so that's the content of our proposed changes. Here's the potential schedule consistent with the GHG policy. We're putting out a straw proposal now for comment through September 16th, holding public information sessions. We are open to small group discussions upon request, and then the full text, hopefully to be available later this fall, looking to finalize by early next year. Next slide. And then again, ways to keep informed. I think all of these links should have been inserted into the Q&A or the chat function earlier. Please let us know if you have trouble finding these. You can just simply Google MEPA and go and navigate to our regulatory updates page as well for full information. Okay, so that concludes the presentation on the climate resilience policy. We will stop the recording now and take some questions.